Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. It's a great pleasure to be with you here today and in such august company. I'm very much looking forward to the discussions today, and I'd like to start by congratulating the Clore Leadership Programme and the Cultural Governance Alliance for pulling together such a fantastic lineup to launch this important initiative. Like many of us who have made our careers in the cultural sector, I've worked with a fair few boards over the years on both sides of the table, as a trustee and also as a member of an executive management team. And like many of us, I have my fair share of stories about things which have not worked as well as they might have done, as well, of course, the stories of working alongside fantastically committed and skilled trustees, doing brilliant work for no financial reward to ensure the success of their organisation. Today, I'll be talking to you with my executive management hat on, and I'd like to give you an insight into how we achieved a complete overhaul of the governance structure of the Edinburgh International Festival. So this is a fairly practical case study, which I hope will illustrate some of the strategic and practical considerations associated with constitutional reform, why it was necessary, the steps taken to achieve buy-in and consensus, the planning and timescale considerations, and finally the end result and next steps. But I think it also illustrates some of the major changes to the governance for charities over the years and the reasons for those developments. I'm very well aware that constitutional reform does not sound like the most riveting subject. That it might at best seem like a necessary evil in order to achieve good things in the future. But in fact, leading this process for the International Festival was incredibly enjoyable, primarily because it went to the heart of the mission of the organisation. I had many fascinating exchanges with a wide range of people who are passionate about the festival, insightful about its history and current role, and deeply committed to its future. It helped to reconnect and deepen engagement with trustees, with members, with stakeholders, and it reinforced a common sense of purpose. It supported a shared ambition for the future. It was actually a really inspirational process. So first, a bit of background. The Edinburgh International Festival was founded in 1947 in the aftermath of the Second World War. It was conceived from the start as a profound international statement, bringing great artists and audiences together from across Europe to celebrate a common language of arts and culture. In the words of the Lord Provost, who is the mayor at the time in 1947, it was established to provide a platform for the flowering of the human spirit. Getting an event of that ambition and scale off the ground in 1947, with rationing still in force, with transport links disrupted, and nowhere near enough hotel rooms or eating places, required an extraordinary coalition of effort from a wide range of local organisations led by the civic leaders of the time. There were calls for the citizens of Edinburgh to open their homes and their hearts to visitors from around the world. This was not just about financial support. The city, business leaders, local gentry, ordinary citizens all bought wholeheartedly into those founding principles of internationalism, exchange and transformation, driven by presenting artists working at the highest level of excellence and aimed at locals and international visitors alike. In other words, they bought into the mission and values of the organisation. So it was wholly appropriate that the founding governance arrangements of the International Festival reflected that wide range of interests and support. Fast forwarding to the current day, although there had been some changes to balance and numbers, that basic representative structure was still in place. The formal structure of the festival is, of course, for charity, and it's also a society limited by guarantee of its members. The membership body, the Festival Society, which had originally been on an invitation-only basis and was peopled by the great and good, had now been open for anybody to join. But the festival had a 21-member board with 16 places nominated or elected by external bodies. The Lord Provost was the chair. There were 6 other councillors. There were representatives of the Chamber of Commerce, of the Trade Unions Council, and people elected from the Festival Society. So the case for reform was fairly clear. It was complex to run. The size of the board made meetings unwieldy, with board members feeling unable to contribute as effectively as they wanted to. There were no formal mechanisms for achieving a balance of skills and diversity amongst the membership. And the ex officio position of the Lord Provost's chair, whilst it ensured a civic weight and status, he or she had many other duties, was not really able to focus to work as the chair of a modern charity as we would expect. So whilst the nomination model had served the organisation well in the past, it was no longer meeting the needs of the organisation. And yet there were real strengths. In particular, the deep engagement with the city council, and with organisations such as the Trade Union Council. There was a sense of ownership and engagement amongst members of the Festival Society, many of whom had been involved for decades, and who were avid attenders of the festival. And the board was functional. There were no major crises. It was delivering its fiduciary and statutory responsibilities effectively. Despite the challenges, we were always able to attract really good trustees. So with so many constituencies and different interests, constitutional reform is always going to be complex and time-consuming. Indeed, an attempt to achieve reform in the late 1980s apparently failed ignominiously when it was voted down at an extremely dramatic AGM. So whilst it had been on my to-do list ever since I took up my current job in I think, 2006, there wasn't a great deal of enthusiasm for reform from the majority of trustees, and we'd taken a pragmatic approach to working with the existing structure. So the decision to finally embark on reform process was driven by a number of factors, including the things which have brought us here together today. The importance, a growing focus on the importance of good governance for charities, gentle nudges from our public sector funders who felt the board could be used more effectively. But the real energy came from within, and it was incremental. Increasing engagement between management and trustees on strategic and business planning was underlining to both of us, to trustees and management, the need for a more effective, fleet of foot and empowered trustee board. We had increasingly engaged trustees becoming increasingly frustrated because the structure was not facilitating that kind of engagement. A new deputy chair who was keen to lead reform, and a trustee with an expertise in charity law were the essential final ingredients. The board committed to a review of governance arrangements at a strategy day in June 2016, and all acknowledging that reform, with the objective of achieving a smaller board recruiting on the basis of relevant skills and experience rather than a nominee model, was desirable. At the same time, there was a real desire to maintain actually what we've been talking about already, the sort of the elements of the structure which were about representation, about engagement with the city. So there then followed a fairly intense 6 months of consultation and negotiation. There were meetings with the Lord Provost, and as a little anecdote, one of the things that we definitely got wrong, we got lots right and we got things wrong, was that the Lord Provost was not able to attend that strategy meeting, and we did not talk to him first about the proposals. We put something in writing, and that caused a little bit of a furore, because the Lord Provost actually, it wasn't from any sense of personal concern, but he felt very strongly about the historic connection, the historic civic connection with the festival. So we did a little bit of regrouping there, to the extent that actually the Lord Provost then became the biggest champion of the process. He led the process from then on in. He led the public meetings. He led the negotiations. So we also had to meet councillors, elected officials, trade unions, Chamber of Commerce, and the membership of the Festival Society. Each of those different groups proved challenging in different ways, because whilst all were united in their support for the festival, each group had their own reasons for engagement and their own sense of the history and importance of that connection. And of course, while nearly everyone agreed with the principle of a skills-based board, all felt there was an exception to be made in their particular case. While time-consuming and occasionally frustrating, these negotiations did also illustrate a deep sense of ownership of the institution of the festival and the role it plays in the city and beyond, and a profound desire to ensure its success into the future. And I think the most important consultation of all, as well as the most rewarding, was with the members of the Festival Society. So whilst we were keen to achieve consensus from all of the bodies who nominated people onto the board, it was the members who have the final vote on changes to the Articles of Association, and a 75% majority is required. I presume the law is the same here as it is in Scotland. So before I embarked on this process, I had thought that although our society members were avid attenders and great supporters, they were pretty disengaged with the governance aspect. I was proved wrong, rather delightfully actually. I wrote to them early on with an outline of proposals and rationale for change and an invitation to contribute their thoughts, and they had plenty to say. As I mentioned earlier, many of them had been involved with the festival for decades. I had lengthy letters and many rather erudite discussions about the role of members, the importance of representation of lay members, the history behind some of the structures. Really fascinating, some of the reasons that it helped me to understand why the festival governance was structured in the way it was, and some of the sort of checks and balances that these people felt had been baked into that structure. I also got some very entertaining and sometimes rather hair-raising stories about AGMs, and it made me realise that every AGM I'd ever been involved with was really quite boring compared to what had happened in the past, although I'm told that's a good thing, to have a boring AGM. So we also held consultation meetings with members, and there's one which was particularly lively. It was also revelatory. It is fair to say that many of the members of the society are of a certain age and a certain social class. And they come from a fairly narrow strata of society. And yet, a key message from that consultation meeting was a strong desire to ensure that any new structure delivered a much more diverse board membership. They wanted to see fewer people like them. For those of you in the audience who know Edinburgh, they would said we don't want to see more people coming from the new town, coming from Ramsay Gardens. We want to see them. That's who we want to see in the audience. That's who we want to see involved on our board. So contrary to a preconception that the membership was likely to be conservative in approach, a key element to the eventual success of the reform was establishing terms of reference for the new board, which included commitments to a 50-50 gender balance by 2020 and to the principles of diversity of background as well as skills. And that commitment, as I say, came from the membership and other stakeholders. It wasn't an imposed commitment. And to take us back to my earlier remarks, it was a really striking example of a shared understanding of the values and mission of the organisation and what's required to support those into the future. Throughout this process, the trustees discussed, reviewed and approved refinements to the proposed new structure. Again, the reforms process itself led to improved engagement and a much deeper understanding of the core values and strategic priorities of the organisation amongst the trustees. A special resolution proposing the new Articles of Association for the festival were approved by an overwhelming majority. I think we had one dissenting vote at the 2017 AGM. The festival now has a modern governance structure with a board of 12 to 14 people, with the chair and trustees appointed in future on a skills basis. The Lord Provost of the city remains chair of the society, but is no longer a trustee. Despite all of the work to get to that point, this was just the start. We're now working on recruitment processes for new board members, including advertising board posts and other methods to try and ensure some diversity of attendance, of membership. We're bedding in the new relationship between management and board, which stems from a more focused board and many of the other issues that we'll be discussing at today's conference. I'm actually very much looking forward to those discussions because there's a lot more work to do. It's a really fascinating journey, and one that has already delivered far more benefits than the original objective of bringing our governance in line with good practice. So, a few summary points in conclusion. When considering constitutional reform, ensure you understand the history and rationale for the structure you currently have. don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. Consider the strengths that you want to retain in any new structure. It might be stating the obvious, but when attempting governance reform, get board buy-in first. It takes time, particularly if you have a membership model and a broad representation model as we did. So plan and timetable each step carefully, but don't allow the momentum to drop. I think if we tried to run this over a year or two, everybody would have just lost interest. And don't be afraid of consultation. Set a direction of travel, but be open to suggestions for improvement and changes. The membership really did make a difference to the eventual structure proposals. And that final proposal was not the same as the one we'd set out with, but we did achieve our key objectives and brought everyone with us. And most important, keep your mission and values at the heart of the process throughout and develop a structure which is right for you. There are guiding principles, but there is no one-size-fits-all approach to good governance. It's what works well and is good for your organisation. And I think a final note, and I'm going to sound like a governance groupie now, governance reviews should not be a once-in-a-generation events. Whilst they're not something to poke away at every year, a regular review and refresh every few years is good practice. It helps trustees and management to focus on their roles and responsibilities and to consider how to ensure that the structure continues to support the mission and objectives and business plans of the organisation. It helps to develop confidence, shared understanding and risk-taking. And, yeah, the governance groupie. It's good fun. Thank you for listening.